Did you know that nearly 2,500 years ago, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama discovered a path that could end suffering? Today, his teachings, known as the Four Noble Truths, have helped millions of people find peace, happiness, and enlightenment. Imagine if you could understand the root of your dissatisfaction, and more importantly, find a way out of it. Well, the Four Noble Truths offer just that. They're not just for Buddhists, they're a universal framework that anyone can apply to their lives. If you've ever felt stuck in cycles of frustration, confusion, or longing, these ancient truths might hold the key to freeing yourself. Stick around, because in the next few minutes, we're going to explore these life-changing teachings that could transform your view on suffering, and how to overcome it. The Four Noble Truths lie at the heart of Buddhism, but their relevance extends far beyond this spiritual tradition. These teachings offer profound insights into human suffering, and more importantly, a clear path out of it. Whether you are someone who practices Buddhism or someone just curious about how to live with greater peace, these truths have something to offer. They're not abstract concepts or lofty ideals, they're practical tools designed to bring real change to your life. In this video, we're going to explore the Four Noble Truths, dive deep into each one, and discover how they provide a framework for understanding and overcoming the suffering that often feels like an inescapable part of life. Presentation of the problem: suffering is a universal experience. It doesn't matter where you're from, how much money you have, or what your life looks like on the outside, everyone, at some point, deals with it. It might show up as stress over work, anxiety about the future, dissatisfaction in relationships, or just an overall feeling of something missing. You've probably experienced moments where everything seems fine on the surface, but deep down, you feel like something isn't quite right. This feeling of discomfort or longing is what the Buddha referred to as dukkha, a word that's often translated as suffering, but also includes things like dissatisfaction, frustration, or unease. What's fascinating, though, is that the Buddha didn't just point out suffering and leave it at that. He didn't accept it as something we had to live with forever. Instead, he proposed a radical idea, that suffering can be understood, and ultimately overcome. The Four Noble Truths are his roadmap for addressing the fundamental problem of human suffering. They're a guide to not just coping with life's challenges, but transcending them. Exploration of the Four Noble Truths. The truth of suffering, dukkha. The first noble truth is perhaps the most straightforward, but it's also the hardest to face. It simply states, life involves suffering. But let's break this down because it's not all doom and gloom. Suffering doesn't mean your life is miserable, or that you're constantly in pain. It means that life is imperfect, that things are constantly changing, and that we often feel a gap between our expectations and reality. It shows up as dissatisfaction in all kinds of ways, from physical pain to emotional distress, from mental anguish to existential frustration. The Buddha taught that suffering is an inherent part of the human condition. It's not something we can avoid or escape by acquiring more stuff, achieving more success, or constantly seeking out distractions. In fact, it's not just about big struggles, there's a subtler form of suffering that many of us overlook. It's the low-level anxiety of constantly chasing after something, the stress of wanting things to stay the same when we know they won't, and the discomfort of feeling that something is always missing. These moments of dissatisfaction are what the Buddha meant by suffering. So, the first step in overcoming suffering is simply acknowledging it as part of our lives. 2. The truth of the cause of suffering, samadaya. The second noble truth goes deeper into understanding the root cause of our suffering. The Buddha identified two primary causes: craving, tanha, and ignorance, avidya. Craving refers to our intense desire for things to be different from how they are. We crave pleasure, wealth, status, love, or even experiences. And while there's nothing wrong with enjoying things in life, when our happiness is dependent on these things, we're setting ourselves up for suffering. Why? Because nothing lasts forever. People change. Material possessions wear out. Even our feelings fluctuate. Ignorance is the lack of understanding about the true nature of things. When we don't see things as they really are, impermanent, interconnected, and constantly changing, we act out of confusion. We mistakenly believe that acquiring things or achieving goals will bring us lasting happiness, when in reality, it only feeds our craving and binds us further to suffering. Ignorance also keeps us from realizing that true peace comes from within, not from external circumstances. So, our suffering isn't caused by external events themselves but by how we respond to them. Our craving and ignorance fuel the cycle of wanting, clinging, and then suffering when we inevitably lose what we've clung to. 3. The truth of the cessation of suffering. Nirodha. Here's the good news: the Buddha didn't stop at diagnosing the problem. He showed us that suffering doesn't have to be endless. The third noble truth is the realization that there is an end to suffering. This state is known as nirvana, which can be described as the extinguishing of craving and ignorance, a profound peace that comes when we no longer cling to transient things. Nirvana isn't some distant, mythical place, it's a way of being, a shift in consciousness that occurs when we no longer depend on external things for our happiness. This doesn't mean we stop enjoying life or cease to care about anything. It means we become less attached to things and more able to experience them with clarity and joy, without the burden of endless wanting. Achieving nirvana or liberation doesn't necessarily mean we'll never feel discomfort again. Instead, it's about developing a relationship with suffering that no longer traps us. It's a freedom from the need to always control and manipulate our circumstances. 4. The truth of the cessation of suffering. Nirodha. Here's the good news: the Buddha didn't stop at diagnosing the problem. He showed us that suffering doesn't have to be endless. The third noble truth is the realization that there is an end to suffering. This state is known as nirvana, which can be described as the extinguishing of craving and ignorance, a profound peace that comes when we no longer cling to transient things. Nirvana isn't some distant, mythical place, it's a way of being, a shift in consciousness that occurs when we no longer depend on external things for our happiness. This doesn't mean we stop enjoying life or cease to care about anything. It means we become less attached to things and more able to experience them with clarity and joy, without the burden of endless wanting. Achieving nirvana or liberation doesn't necessarily mean we'll never feel discomfort again. Instead, it's about developing a relationship with suffering that no longer traps us. It's a freedom from the need to always control and manipulate our circumstances. So, to recap, the Four Noble Truths help us understand the nature of suffering, identify its causes, and reveal the path to end it. They show us that, by letting go of our attachments and delusions, we can transcend suffering and find true peace. The teachings of the Buddha offer us a roadmap that, when followed with commitment and practice, can lead to freedom from dissatisfaction and a life of greater contentment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Four Noble Truths. Have you applied any of them in your own life? Drop a comment below and let's discuss. And if you're interested in learning more about other Buddhist teachings or deepening your understanding, be sure to check out my other videos. Peace and wisdom await.